So like I said, another aspect of the module that you'll be going through is thinking about data. I know that we are inundated with lots and lots and lots of data. Some of you just went through your state testing, so I'm sure that there was a lot of data leading up to that, and now you're waiting on the data, which can be really stressful too, because I know you've worked so hard, and so you're waiting to see how students did. And so we're going to talk a little bit about just different ways that we can analyze data, just keeping students in mind. And so this quote comes from "Data is only one aspect of analysis." And it says, "Good assessments provide a tremendous amount of raw data, but great analysis is impossible unless that data is recorded in a readily useful form." And so if we might have pages and pages and tables of data, but we want to think about how can we use all of that in a meaningful way that's really going to think about the students as humans instead of, just a number on a page. So some data tips. When viewing data, we want to see it in an organized manner. And you all probably have different programs that you use within your districts, whether they're softwares like Eduphoria or, oh my gosh, there's so many of them where you can just pull up tables and tables and tables of data. And so there are different ways to organize data. And so we're going to talk a little bit about why that's important. And we also want to think about quality over quantity. And last, it's really important to make sure that we have the test in hand too, that we have that ability to look at analyze questions. When we first get the data, I know here in Texas, when we first get it, we from our state tests, we do not have the test in hand. It takes a while for the state to release those tests to us. I don't know how long New York State takes. I know that they have them available eventually. But for us, when we're first looking at that data, we don't have that test in hand. So it's really hard, when we don't have the context of the test to think about, why students answered what they did. So that's something that's really important. And then we have our potential ways to organize data, whether it's the question level, standard, by student group, or individual student level. And so these different ways to organize data have different benefits, and they'll help us better understand why students performed as they did. Was it expected? Was it unexpected? And so is this something that I've already taught? Is it something that I taught in a different way? And so all of these different ways to organize are really important. So at the question level, we often overlook this level of analysis, but we want to make sure that we ask the question, why did students not perform well on a particular question? And so that's why it's important to have that question level and have the test in hand. And then some other things to consider across your class by looking at those questions is, was the same incorrect answer selected? So maybe there's a question where less than 50% of your class answered correctly. What was the incorrect answer across the class? How can we use that incorrect answer as data to help us analyze what was the misconception that students had and how can we move forward and make a plan to meet them where they're at? And then also, what's the style of the question? Sometimes questions are asked in a way that we haven't exposed our children to yet. And, we try to teach as authentically as possible, but we also know that test taking as a genre itself is something that we owe to our kids. We know we don't want to test prep or teach to the test all year, but we also need to be able to teach them that test taking is its own genre so that we can help them understand the way that, tests ask questions. I know a lot of times questions are asked in ways that we don't typically, think or talk as teachers. And so it's really important to think about that style of question so that we can help our students in that way. And then looking at the standard level, we want to look collectively at the questions that measure that same standard. So that way we can think about, across these standards, what were our students' strengths? And then what are some areas that they can continue to grow in? So looking at the standard level will help you with that. And thinking about if there's connections across standards as well. We think about how our standards get increasingly more complex with more and more complex text. So how can we make connections across those standards and make sure that students have the foundations for what they need in order to be readers in more complex texts or writers in more complex genres. And so, for example, with phonological awareness, we know that rhyme recognition comes before production. So if our students, maybe in a phonological awareness assessment, did not perform well in their rhyme production, then we can look at that rhyme recognition and see, what are some shifts that we can make in our teaching to support our students with that phonological awareness so that they can make that progression. And then student group analysis, we might look across classes or grade levels. I think a lot of times more at the secondary level, we'll look across grade level. And elementary, we tend to look across classes. Or if you're departmentalized, that's another way to consider looking at data. And then we can also think about, who are our students in our small groups and intervention groups? What does their data look like? And so really honing in on that student group analysis at that smaller, more detailed level can really help us with our teaching and reteaching. And so a potential question to ask, what trends emerge when we look at different student groups? And so making sure too that we're really aware of our student groups. We'll talk a little bit more, or you'll have some information in the modules about ability grouping versus flex grouping. When we work in PLCs or ILTs, we know that common assessments and looking at that common assessment data is something that's really common. And that's great because that can help us, those formative common assessments can help us form our small groups, but we also want to be really aware about ability grouping our students because we don't want to set them on a path that's not necessarily going to lead to success. We need to have multiple abilities so students can share ideas and think across texts together. And we, like I said, learning is social. And so we need to be able to have those conversations and those complex conversations with multiple levels of learners. So we'll look a little bit more deeply into that later. And then the student level analysis. So it's really important too to think about students' individual performance. So when we look closely at the student, Kenyatta, if we were to just look at the number, she received a 48% on this assessment. And so without looking at the student level, it's really easy to just say, oh, well, she doesn't get it. She's having a lot of learning issues. I don't know what to do. Well, when you look at the student analysis, you can see that questions 1 through 4, as well as 10 through 13, those were answered correctly. 5 and 9 were incorrect, and then 14 on were incorrect. And so then we're able to ask deeper questions. What are some of the possibilities of why this student answered 14 through 23 incorrectly? Was there a bubbling error where she was one off and then the rest were off? Or did time run out? And so they were automatically marked incorrectly. We weren't able to get an accurate analysis of her thinking. Did she have test anxiety? Did question 14 throw her off? And, did she have a hard time with the rest of them? Or was it stamina? That's something that we're finding a lot too, especially, with our unfinished learning that we have with the pandemic. What we're seeing a lot across the state is that for the second half of the test or the last couple of passages of the test, students are tending to perform more poorly because of stamina issues. So how can we teach students to give themselves breaks, or how can we allow time for building stamina in the classroom through self-selected reading and conferring with students and self-selection of books and that time to read and process text. So there's all different types of things that might come up with looking at that student level analysis. So that one, I know time is always an issue. And so it's really important that we have, as leaders, enable time for this level of data analysis so that we really can meet our students where they're at. And I'm hoping in the next year we will have less shortages, because I know a lot of times those meetings tend to happen, with extended planning time and things like that that's given to us as educators. And so this is something that can be really difficult, but it's really, really important. Thoughts, questions, concerns at this point? So if we're working through a needs assessment, we want to understand the assessments that are administered, the form and format of each assessment, and which standards are assessed. And this is just kind of the broader analysis of it. And then for that data analysis, thinking broadly, working in teams, looking at data, we might think, well, how well did the whole class do? Which standards were strengths or weaknesses, and how did the assessment or question type influence the results? Who has not met the learning standard and who has met it and who has not, and how did students perform on older standards versus newer ones? And just this broad overview can give you some teaching points moving forward. So for example, if there was a standard that more than 50% of the class did not master, then that would be something that maybe we need to reteach whole group. But if it's just a select group of students, then we know that that's not something that we need to spend our whole group mini lesson time on, but that's something that we can work on in small groups. So just those broad questions can give us some big ideas about ways to move forward. But then we also have some ways to think through and dig even deeper. And this really gets into like that nitty gritty where we can really make even more careful decisions about next step for our students. And so for assessments, we want to think, is this assessment the best way to collect information on the intended standards? How does the assessment provide useful data? What's not useful about the assessment? Does the assessment format show preference for certain students over others? Who created the assessments? And how are they normed? And then in thinking about data analysis, digging deeper, did all students answer the same wrong answer to missed questions? Understand students' performance on standards across questions. We want to think, are performance on similar standards related? How does one standard lead to the next? We want to look individually at students' performance and then also look within and across student groups for who's receiving instruction and in what context and format. So thinking about intervention or small groups in Tier 1 and in Tier 2. And so these types of questions, thinking about data protocols, working in teams and groups can really help us dig deeper into making those decisions. We know that sometimes certain assessments that we give are mandated, whether it's by the school or district or state. But then we also have to consider if that is the only data point that we should be using to get the full picture. So we also have to consider multiple forms of assessment when we're thinking about students, because especially if it's just a one-off, there are so many factors that could go into that student's day that could have affected their performance. So we want to give them the benefit of the doubt and looked at multiple ways to assess to get a really clear picture of the whole child. Okay. So that was just a big overview of data. And I'm sure a lot of this sounds familiar to you in the work that you're already doing and you're already in, especially as you start to get your state test results and need to start analyzing those and making plans and next steps for your students. And so in the upcoming module, you'll also have some more information around this.